I carried the last box up the narrow staircase, the morning sun spilling across the kitchen table like it was welcoming me home. At 65, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. Quiet mornings with strong coffee afternoons, spent sorting books in my little office, and evenings curled up in the guest room, reading novels I'd promised myself I'd finally tackle. My name is Eleanor Whitmore Ellie to most, and I had spent decades living other people's schedules, other people's rules. Retirement, Derek said, was my chance to reclaim a life that was wholly mine. The house smelled faintly of cedar and paint, a clean slate filled with potential. The guest room already had a soft beige carpet, perfect for a yoga mat or a quiet afternoon nap. My office overlooked the backyard, where lilacs bloomed against the fence, their scent drifting through the open windows. I paused in the doorway, imagining how slowly these rooms would come alive with routines that didn't revolve around anyone else's expectations. Derek leaned against the counter, a hint of pride in his posture. He had overseen every detail of the renovation, fussing over beams and counters like a craftsman building a cathedral. I smiled at him, grateful for the work he put in, but a small, uneasy flutter tickled at my chest. It wasn't anything tangible, just the faint awareness that life never stayed quiet for long. Boxes unpacked, coffee poured, and a faint breeze stirring the curtains. I set the first book on the office desk. Somewhere beyond these walls, the world was already creeping in, and I had no idea who might show up next. The doorbell rang just as I was arranging fresh flowers on the kitchen island. I opened it to Sandra and Glenn, my daughter-in-law's parents, carrying overly bright smiles and a box of pastries that had clearly been picked up on the way. Sandra's eyes immediately scanned the room, lingering on the pale curtains and the new backsplash. "Oh, this is very bright," she said, tilting her head as if the sunlight itself were a personal offense. Glenn leaned over to examine the countertop, muttering something about quartz being flashy for a kitchen. I smiled and nodded. "Thank you. It's what we chose together." They bustled in, setting down their treats, commenting on the spacing of the chairs and the thickness of the carpet. I kept my responses light and accommodating, showing them where the guest room was, letting them peek into the office, where I had stacked my books. Derek hovered nearby casually, sipping his coffee, offering the occasional chuckle, or "They're just teasing Ellie" whenever my smile faltered. Sandra moved to the fridge, inspecting how the condiments were arranged, then pointed out that the silverware drawer could be more organized. "Just my little OCD," she added with a laugh that carried a little too much authority. I nodded and said, "I'll keep that in mind," while tucking a small sigh behind the corners of my mouth. Glenn sank into the living room sofa, stretching his legs, and asked if it was okay to adjust the cushions to his liking. Derek smiled and waved. "Of course they're comfortable now, right?" I bit back a retort and instead offered them coffee and guided them to the sunny nook. As laughter and light chatter filled the air, I realized this wasn't going to be just a one-time visit. The gentle critiques and the subtle takeover hinted at patterns I hadn't anticipated. I kept smiling, reminding myself that being a gracious host was part of the exercise, at least for now. It started subtly at first, just a Sunday here and there, but soon Sandra and Glenn arrived every weekend, without fail. The kitchen, once a quiet space for me to experiment with recipes, became their staging ground. Glenn claimed the corner of the counter for his morning papers, while Sandra perched on a stool offering unsolicited advice on how I seasoned the chicken or arranged the cutlery. The guest room, meant for yoga or reading, slowly transformed into their personal retreat. Blankets and pillows appeared, as if they had lived there for years. I found myself constantly shifting between roles, chef, housekeeper, hostess, and mediator, while trying to squeeze in time for my own projects. My office became a jumble of papers as I worked from home, often interrupted by the thud of Glenn adjusting the couch cushions, or Sandra humming loudly while reorganizing my bookshelves. Derek hovered in the background, offering polite smiles and occasional chuckles, but never intervening. His inaction, once comforting, now felt like complicity, a quiet agreement that my discomfort wasn't worth addressing. The small annoyances mounted. The television blared in the living room while I prepared dinner, drowning out the radio I preferred. My carefully arranged kitchen utensils were subtly shifted, and chairs I had aligned for balance were slightly askew when I returned from a short break. Each weekend, these minor invasions compounded, and by mid-afternoon, a dull frustration settled in my chest like a stubborn stone. I tried to remind myself that they meant well, that family visits were supposed to be enjoyable, that I had the choice to smile and let things slide. But with each passing week, the sense of invisibility in my own home deepened. Even in quiet moments, as I stacked dishes or straightened cushions, I could feel the silent assertion of their presence pressing against my boundaries. Somewhere between polite tolerance and simmering resentment, I realized this pattern was not going to end on its own, and neither, I suspected, would Derek's passive acquiescence. The first overnight stay caught me off guard. I had left the guest room neatly prepared for a weekend of quiet reflection and a bit of journaling, only to return and find Sandra. Sprawled across the bed, her silk robe draped over the chair, and Glenn reclining with a newspaper in hand. "Your bed is so much better for my back," Glenn explained casually, as if my furniture had been placed for anyone but me. The faint scent of menthol cream and cologne lingered in the room, replacing the calming aroma of the lavender sachets I had tucked into the dresser drawers. Their critiques began as passing comments, but quickly turned into constant observations. "You don't season it quite like I do," Sandra said, while inspecting my sauce, tilting her head at my choice of herbs. Glenn muttered about the laundry detergent, insisting the lavender scent irritated his skin. I smiled, nodded, and made the adjustments quietly, tucking away the irritation that tightened around my ribs. Derek, standing nearby, waved off my subtle protests with a casual, "Ellie, you're overthinking it." They mean well. As the evening wore on, I began mentally cataloging each intrusion. The reclined chairs left in the wrong places, the books on the coffee table shuffled, my carefully stacked dishes rearranged. I felt trapped in my own home, every corner, touched every surface, claimed by someone else's comfort. Even the small rituals I had cherished, the quiet moments with tea in the sunlit kitchen, the orderly lines of my office, had been overtaken by their presence. I tried to remind myself that this was temporary, that family visits were meant to be enjoyable, that patience was part of the exercise. Yet, with each passing hour, the weight of invisibility pressed harder, making me aware of how little my comfort and preferences mattered. I kept smiling, serving and adjusting, but a small, stubborn ember of resentment began to glow beneath my polite exterior. Somewhere in the midst of the laughter critiques and rearranged furniture, I realized that gentle requests might no longer be enough, and that the boundaries I once assumed would be respected were being silently ignored. The quiet mornings I had envisioned were gone. I had once loved lingering over tea while the sunlight hit the kitchen table, but now the sounds of Glenn humming off-key from the living room or Sandra rearranging yet another drawer sliced through my calm before it even began. My hobbies, journaling, sorting through old letters, even reading a single chapter of a novel, were constantly interrupted by questions, instructions, or unsolicited advice. Laundry I had folded neatly would be re-washed or tossed aside, the scent of my chosen detergent dismissed for theirs. Dinner became a battlefield of subtle critiques. Sandra insisted on adjusting, seasoning mid-cook, offering tips as if my experience of decades in the kitchen was meaningless. Glenn hovered with commentary on timing, quantity, or even plate presentation. I moved with practiced grace, serving smiles and nods, but my chest felt tight and my jaw sore from holding back the words that wanted to escape. Derek watched from across the room, sipping his wine, giving occasional reassurances that only deepened the sting. "They're just trying to help," he'd say. But to me, it sounded like dismissal of months of exhaustion, of every compromise I had silently made. By mid-afternoon, a sharp tension had built between us. I caught myself glancing at Derek, wondering if he truly noticed the erosion of my space, my time, my authority. A small, quiet anger had begun to simmer beneath my politeness. I realized I could no longer be the gracious hostess and the silent observer simultaneously. Something had to give. I retreated briefly to the office, closing the door behind me. The quiet space, a fragile island of autonomy. I traced the edges of my bookshelves with my fingertips, cataloging the intrusions and weighing the consequences of action. Every polite nod, every small compromise, every unnoticed effort had accumulated into a pile too heavy to ignore. I thought of ways to assert control without igniting outright conflict, ways to protect my home and my sanity while maintaining the decorum I valued. The realization settled uncomfortably in my chest. Patience had limits, and politeness could no longer shield my peace. Something had to change, and I knew with a sudden clarity that the next step would require both courage and careful planning. I called Vanessa the evening after Glenn and Sandra had left my voice tight from a day of polite compliance and quiet irritation. Vanessa had been my friend for over 40 years, the kind of friend who could read between the lines even when I minimized everything. "I can't keep doing this," I confessed, pacing my kitchen, the fading sunlight painting the counters gold. "Every weekend it's like I'm not even here. Derek doesn't see it. Or maybe he just doesn't care." Vanessa listened without interruption, nodding through the pauses, and then she asked the questions I hadn't allowed myself to voice. "So what's your plan?" Her calm, practical tone grounded me. I realized I had spent months reacting rather than acting, letting the situation dictate my mood, my time, and my home. We began to strategize. A temporary absence, I decided, would allow me to reclaim the house in a way they couldn't ignore. I could visit a cousin under the guise of helping with errands, leave small reminders that the space belonged to me, and subtly gauge their reactions without confrontation. Vanessa suggested packing only essentials, leaving the rest to their occupancy, and making sure Derek understood the necessity without making it a battle. I visualized each step with precision. The suitcase tucked by the door, a note casually left on the kitchen counter, the gentle assertion of absence as a statement in itself. Every move was designed to reclaim control without overt aggression, a silent but unmistakable message that boundaries existed, and I intended to enforce them. Sitting back with a cup of tea, I reflected on the patience I had offered for so long and the frustration that had grown into a quiet determination. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of empowerment. The tension that had built around my kitchen and my guest room transformed into a kind of energy, calculated, focused, and deliberate. I could feel the shift within me, a readiness to act, to regain ownership of the home that had long been my sanctuary in theory, if not in practice. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops, I had a plan in place, each step plotted carefully. The thought of executing it filled me with a mixture of nervous anticipation and quiet triumph. For the first time in weeks, I felt as if the balance had shifted in my favor. I left early that Friday morning, the sun barely touching the rooftops, my suitcase tucked neatly in the back of the car. Just a quick trip to help my cousin, I told Derek, who barely looked up from his coffee. He nodded, distracted, and I realized I was stepping into a rare freedom that had been months in the making. The drive through Portland's familiar streets was quiet each turn and stop, reinforcing the small but significant act of reclaiming space for myself. Back at the house, Sandra and Glenn immediately settled into the rhythm they had imposed for weeks. Glenn claimed the living room sofa without hesitation, flipping through the newspaper, while Sandra lingered in the kitchen, inspecting cupboards and adjusting shelves. For the first few hours, they moved with surprising coordination, yet little tensions began to bubble. The cereal box misplaced a chair. Slightly askew, minor irritations that might have gone unnoticed had I been present to absorb or redirect them. From my cousin's porch, I checked in occasionally, catching glimpses of the house through her security camera app. I watched as Glenn struggled to balance his coffee cup on the counter without knocking over a stack of magazines, and Sandra muttered over a spilled dish towel. A subtle smile tugged at my lips. The quiet chaos was a reminder that my presence had always been the buffer, the soft boundary that had kept everything running smoothly. For the first time in weeks, I felt that sense of autonomy. I had been craving the liberty to move, breathe, and think without interruption. Every hour spent away strengthened my resolve. I realized that absence could be as powerful as any confrontation, that sometimes reclaiming control didn't require anger, just careful strategy, and the patience to see it through. The first rumble of the truck's engine woke me before dawn. I watched from the rental townhouse across town, a cup of coffee in hand, as two movers climbed out checking the paperwork clipped to their clipboards. Sandra, peering out the living room window, blinked in confusion. "Are they bringing in furniture for us?" she asked, voice pitched somewhere between excitement and panic. Glenn stepped forward, adjusting his glasses, trying to read the manifest. The movers carried boxes labeled with their names and carefully wrapped dressers, a recliner, and a full-size mattress. Every item they brought in transformed the living room and guest room from borrowed spaces into their claimed territory. Sandra's mouth opened, then closed, as she realized the plan I had orchestrated from miles away. Derek arrived minutes later, keys in hand, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Ellie, what is happening?" he asked, though. His voice carried no anger, only stunned awareness. I smiled faintly from my vantage point. My months of careful planning, the small absences, the strategic timing, it all culminated here silently, but unmistakably. The furniture placement was meticulous, everything aligned with my intentions, yet executed without a single word of confrontation. The house, long a stage for their weekly domination, was now unmistakably under my quiet control. Glenn tried to intervene, asking about a misplaced chair, while Sandra fussed over the exact placement of the throw pillows. I imagined them moving cautiously around their new space, unsure of boundaries that had always been invisible when I was present. Derek finally looked around, seeing the reality of my decisions, and for the first time, he understood the decisiveness I had been capable of all along. I allowed a small chuckle to escape. There was humor in their astonishment, vindication in the flawless execution of my plan, and a moral satisfaction that no amount of polite endurance could have provided. Weeks of patient strategy and careful observation had led to this moment. From afar, I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to autonomy reclaimed, boundaries asserted, and a house that had always been mine, quietly but unmistakably. Back at my rental townhouse, I spread the paperwork across the dining table, each document a quiet declaration of authority. Mortgage statements, property deeds, and carefully drafted separation clauses formed a tangible boundary that no one could ignore. Derek had agreed to handle the financial accounts jointly for years, trusting me implicitly. But now those same accounts became instruments of autonomy. I reviewed each clause with meticulous care, ensuring my rights were protected and my intentions unmistakable. I sent a digital copy of the separation agreement to Derek, keeping the tone neutral but firm. Moments later, his voice came over the phone, tense and uncertain. "Ellie, are you serious about this?" I remained calm. explaining that the house long my personal space required boundaries. The family had already moved in, and it was now clear that control had shifted. Derek listened silent at first, then finally asked clarifying questions, signaling the first glimmer of recognition for the authority I had quietly asserted. Meanwhile, I reflected on the months that had led to this moment. Patience stretched thin, repeated intrusions, subtle negotiations, and the careful timing of absences. Each minor annoyance, each critique and rearranged chair had been cataloged and transformed into a strategy, a roadmap for reclaiming what was mine without confrontation. The satisfaction was not in forcing compliance, but in orchestrating an outcome that respected my intelligence and foresight. I imagined Sandra and Glenn finally aware that their casual dominion had limits, moving carefully within the house that had always belonged to me. The laughter, the small critiques, they were still present, but now tempered by an invisible line I had drawn. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of decision resting comfortably in my hands, and with it, a renewed confidence. Sitting back, I allowed myself a deep breath. The house, my home, was legally and practically mine once more. The months of endurance strategy and calculated patience had culminated in clarity, order, and the restoration of my peace. I realized that control did not require aggression, only intelligence and the courage to act decisively when the time was right. The small townhouse felt alive with possibilities. Ellie moved slowly through each room, unpacking only what she truly needed: a few favorite books, her journal, and the tea set she loved to use on quiet mornings. The space was modest, but hers entirely. Every drawer, every shelf, every corner belonged to her alone. Sunlight pooled across the living room floor, and for the first time in months, the silence was uninterrupted. I sank into the armchair by the window, a mug of chamomile warming my hands, and let myself breathe fully. Lessons from the past weeks settled into clarity. Boundaries were not mere rules, but reflections of self-respect. Autonomy was not just about control over space, but over how I chose to live each day, free from unsolicited critique or intrusion. Calls and texts from friends, long postponed visits, and invitations to book clubs and afternoon walks filled my calendar with the kind of quiet companionship I had been craving. I returned to hobbies, abandoned rediscovering the rhythm of daily life on my own terms. Gardening, sketching, reading, all small joys now amplified by the freedom to engage without expectation. That evening, as the golden light faded from the windows, I sat on the balcony, watching the city soften into twilight. The house, the struggle, the careful maneuvers. It all felt distant yet necessary. In the calm, I felt an unexpected triumph, a peace earned through patient strategy and unwavering self-respect. My life was mine again, quiet, intentional, and fully alive.